gone too far. D is for dramatic. So there's something about the event which has felt dramatic. And at this point, I should also mention that for each of these 4 points, it's a very subjective assessment. So I might find the incident, the moment in time, the event, unexpected and dramatic, but somebody in my family who was there going through the same event may not have found it as unexpected or dramatic. So they might not have experienced a UDIN from the event, even though I did. So it's very subjective, very personal as to how we respond to events that happen in our lives and whether or not we find them traumatic. D is for dramatic. I is for isolating. That doesn't necessarily mean I am alone, but that I feel isolated. So we know that sometimes we can feel more isolated, more lonely in a crowd than if we are actually in a space by ourselves. And isolating here is like where Brené Brown talks about vulnerability and shame. And she says that we feel shame around situations where we don't feel we can talk about it. And that's the kind of thing that isolation here can be. Something happens, we don't feel we can talk about it to others. Gabor Mate often speaks to people who say, I had a good childhood, why am I experiencing problems later in life? I didn't have any trauma. And he, through his questioning, draws out an event in their life, and then he asks them, and who did you tell? So perhaps, for example, childhood bullying, being bullied at school in the playground. Who did you tell? Did you tell your parents? Did you tell a teacher? And those incidents where the person then says, no, I didn't, that could be trauma. Perhaps they didn't because they felt their parents would expect them to be able to stand up for themselves, or they felt the teacher wouldn't understand, or that they might get blamed. Perhaps they were somewhere they shouldn't have been. And that's how the incident came about. So these sorts of things can leave us feeling shame and therefore feeling isolated, because when we feel shame, we don't want to talk about what's happened. Or it might be that we don't feel anybody else will understand. As I said, this is very subjective, and it might be that I am judging my own response, and I might be saying, I'm an adult now, why am I responding that way? Or actually, it was such a small thing. Why was I so upset by it? So we can tend to minimize our own responses. But if that's going on, again, it can leave us feeling very isolated and unable to talk to others for fear of them saying, why are you so upset? When actually deep inside we are, and we're not taking the time to acknowledge that and respect it and support ourselves in that. The last aspect of UDIN then is no strategy, where the incident leaves us feeling like, I have no strategy, I don't know how to deal with this, I don't have the resources, I don't know what to do. And I'm left in maybe in that moment of freeze or in flop, where I don't know what to do, I don't know how to respond. So that is a UDIN, if it can tick all 4 of those boxes. But what might a UDIN look like? Can I give you some examples? Indeed. So these are examples of UDINs that you might have experienced or know some people who have been through similar situations. And I'll take you through each one. The first one might be somebody saying to their partner, I've been sleeping with your best friend. And they might have known nothing about it, assumed that their partner was faithful and their best friend just would never do such a thing. So to hear that in such close quarters where you think, I know these people inside out, how can I have missed it? How can they have done that to me? Definitely could be very unexpected, very dramatic, very isolating. Who do you talk to about something like that? You would have talked to your partner or your best friend, probably, except they're the ones who have gone behind your back. And what strategy could you possibly have? Because you never expected that to happen. You weren't prepared. The second image could be something like, there was an example of this in Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, where perhaps somebody is in an accident and their car goes on fire. In Bessel van der Kolk's example, somebody he was working with had been in a multi-car pileup. Their car had been buried and the car above them was on fire, and they couldn't get out either side of the vehicle they were in. They were trapped. So they definitely had those feelings of, I'm not going to get out of this alive. I'm going to die. Obviously, very traumatic. Or, as in the next example, being held up at gunpoint, being mugged, and thinking this just isn't worth dying for. Or that betrayal, where a good friend, perhaps a member of your family, you feel has gone behind your back, done something that you never expected that someone so close to you would do, and that horrible, deep sense of betrayal. So those are some of the more overt, obvious examples of UDINs, but I mentioned it can also be the covert things that happen to us, or the repeated small t trauma things that we experience. Examples of these could be being shouted at as a child. And it's not meaning to point fingers of blame, because our parents parent us probably very similar to the way that they were parented. And if their parent was strict and used strong discipline, probably that's what they're going to do to their own children, because that's what they have been brought up to believe is how you prepare your child for the world. So that can leave the child feeling that they are not worth being praised or being supported and uplifted. It can leave them feeling that life is a very scary thing, that the world outside is a very scary thing. I know that my dad used to say to me, the world is a big, bad, scary place. And I really took that on board. And because it was said to me when I was very small, I wasn't able to balance that, to filter it, to rationalize it. I just assumed, like that childhood thing of there are monsters under the bed. That was my concept of the world. And I guess it's kind of like years ago that on maps, they thought the world was flat and beyond a certain point, there be monsters. And that was my concept of how the world was, that it was going to be big, it was going to be scary, it was overwhelming. I needed to be on constant high vigilant alert, ready to respond to these threats, these monsters that might jump out at me from anywhere. And although rationally, as I grew older, I could say, I know they're not real. I know this is a concept or it's a metaphor. But inside, my inner child was still quaking at the thought of those monsters and at having to face them as the age of that inner child. Also, from the ACE scores, Adverse Childhood Experience scores, we know that even if the child isn't the direct recipient of a parent's anger, if they're in a household where arguments and possibly physical arguments are going on, that is a trauma for the child. So in this second example, going across to the top right-hand corner, where the child is trying not to observe, but is there in the room while an argument is going on, that's traumatic for them. The bottom left image, it may be that the child doesn't feel seen, doesn't feel heard, doesn't have the attention they need to support them as they're growing up, and therefore they're feeling very isolated. And that can be a covert trauma that builds up over time, where you just are left with a sense of, Nobody sees me, nobody hears me, I'm not important, I'm not worth that attention, which then can leave us feeling very vulnerable to similar situations when we get older, where we are maybe working in a situation where we have a bullying boss. And if we're already traumatized by our childhood, maybe something from one of the earlier images, then we can be very vulnerable to experiencing that bullying. And we know as well that bullies choose the people they will bully, because a bully inside is somebody who's been bullied. They are feeling small, so that's why they puff up, to be more of a threat than the threat they feel faced with. And so the cycle perpetuates. The bullied becomes the bully, who bullies others, who then become the victim and go on. Sometimes, not always, obviously, but it can become a repeating cycle.